The year was 2041 when the Nexus first appeared in Earth's orbit. A colossal ring of black metal that hummed with frequencies no human instrument could fully decode. It was not a weapon, not immediately, but something far more calculated. A declaration, a boundary, a message written in the language of dominance. The Velthri had arrived, a species 1,000 years ahead of humanity in technology, in biology, in every measurable metric that civilizations use to compare themselves. T-wary, tall crystalline beings whose thoughts moved faster than synapses, whose ships bent light itself into whose weapons could unmake matter at the molecular level. They looked at humanity the way a farmer looks at weeds, with mild irritation and absolute certainty about what needed to be done. But they were patient, methodical, and above all, strategic. They did not come to destroy. They came to control. The Nexus was their masterpiece. A quantum-entangled network of signal relays that wrapped around Earth like an invisible cage, monitoring every transmission, every satellite, every military communication. Within 6 months of its deployment, Earth's major governments had no secrets from the Velthri. None. Not one hidden bunker, not one encrypted channel, not one whispered rebellion in a basement. And then came the Compact of Subjugation, a document presented not in anger but in the tone of reasonable adults, explaining consequences to unruly children. Humanity would reduce its military to ceremonial levels. Humanity would share all scientific research. Humanity would pay tribute in rare earth minerals and biological samples every 10 years. In exchange, the Velthri promised not to sterilize the planet. 37 nations signed it within a week. They had no choice. The Nexus made resistance impossible, or so everyone believed, but there were those who refused to believe it. They called themselves the Ember Coalition, a loose network of military veterans, scientists, engineers, linguists, and ordinary people who looked at the Compact and felt something primal ignite inside them. Not rage, not despair, something quieter and far more dangerous. Determination. If you are watching this story for the first time, take a moment right now to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves a good underdog story. Because what comes next is going to take your breath away. Commander Yarachun was 43 years old when the Compact was signed. A former deep space navigation officer with 2 decades of experience reading the patterns of stars and the behavior of hostile environments. She had short-cropped silver hair, a scar across her left jaw from a training accident on the lunar base, and eyes that her soldiers described as the color of deep ocean water. Calm on the surface, crushing pressure beneath. She stood in a concrete room beneath the Yorel Mountains and looked at a holographic map of the Nexus relay positions and said, very quietly, "Every cage has a door. We just have to find it." Her team was small, 41 people, and their resources were laughable compared to what the Velthri commanded. But they had something the Velthri had not accounted for. They had 430 years of accumulated human stubbornness, because the Ember Coalition was not born in 2041. Its roots went back to 2041, yes, but its true founding document was written in 2043, 2 years after the Compact, by a woman named Dr. Priya Okafor. Dr. Okafor was a quantum communications physicist who had been working on faster-than-light messaging theory when the Velthri arrived and made her research simultaneously more urgent and more dangerous. She wrote a 70-page document called The Long Patience, and it became the founding philosophy of the Ember Coalition's multi-generational resistance strategy. Its central argument was simple. Humanity could not fight the Velthri now. Not in 2043. Not in 2053. Not even in 2143. But in 2473. That was a different question entirely. The plan was not a battle plan. It was a family plan. Dr. Okafor understood something that the Velthri had failed to model in their probability matrices. Humans do not simply pass down genes. They pass down stories, skills, grudges, and dreams across generations. With a fidelity that no other species in the known galaxy had achieved, the Velthri had studied human history, of course. They had scanned every book, every database, every archive. But they had missed the invisible curriculum, the things taught not in schools but at dinner tables, in workshops, in whispered conversations between grandparents and grandchildren. The Amber Coalition would use that. They would build a multi-generational institution disguised as something completely ordinary. They would build families, not metaphorical families. Actual ones, deliberately structured, carefully matched, intentionally seeded with the skills and knowledge humanity would need for centuries later. Each generation would know only what it needed to know. Each cell of the resistance would be isolated from the others, connected only through a web of dead-drop protocols and inherited memory techniques that the Velthari would never think to scan for, because the Veltori did not understand family loyalty. They were a hive-resonant species. Individual relationships meant nothing to them. Kinship bonds were, in their assessment, an evolutionary quirk with no strategic relevance. That assessment was the biggest mistake any alien civilization had ever made. The first generation of the Coalition, born between 2043 and 2060, were the engineers and scientists. They built things, small things, quiet things, microfabrication labs hidden in the walls of ordinary houses, signal scramblers disguised as kitchen appliances, data storage systems embedded in agricultural equipment that the Velthari never bothered to inspect because it produced food, and food had no military relevance. They mapped the Nexus relay system not with any technology the Velthari could detect, but with patient human observation. Generations of astronomers pretending to study stars while actually charting the precise orbital mechanics of every relay node. By 2095, the Ember Coalition had a complete map of the Nexus. Every relay, every redundancy circuit, every maintenance window when specific nodes went offline for recalibration. They shared it across exactly 12 families, in exactly 12 countries, encoded in folk songs, in the patterns of hand-woven textiles, in the ordering of spices on a kitchen shelf. Please take a moment right now to share this video with someone like it. If the story has you hooked, subscribe so you never miss an episode, and let other people experience this epic tale alongside you. The second generation, born between 2065 and 2090, were the linguists and psychologists. Their mission was to understand the Velthari from the inside out. This was the generation that learned to think like the enemy, not to become them, but to anticipate them. To find the gaps in their perception, the assumptions baked into their worldview. A young man named Kalo Konkwo, great-grandson of Dr. Okafor's closest colleague, spent 20 years working as a cultural liaison between the Velthari Administrative Office in Lagos and the local human population. He was, by all appearances, a collaborator. A man who smiled at the crystalline administrators and translated their directives into the 23 languages of the region with perfect clarity. What the Velthari did not know was that Kale was also translating in the other direction, decoding the Velthari's administrative language, their bureaucratic rhythms, the particular patterns of negligence and arrogance that define every empire in history. He filed reports. Not to the Velthari, but to his mother, who told his daughters, who told their children. 40 pages of observations, encoded in the recipes of his grandmother's cookbook. They are not watching for subtlety, he wrote. They're watching for force. They cannot conceive of an enemy who moves at the speed of culture rather than the speed of weapons. He was right. The third generation, born between 2090 and 2130, were the soldiers. But not soldiers in any traditional sense that the Velthari would recognize or scan for. They were doctors who knew anatomy at a level that included Veltharia physiology. They were construction workers who could, given 14 hours and the right materials, build a shielded room invisible to Nexus sensors. They were farmers who understood soil chemistry well enough to produce specific compounds that interacted with biology in ways that were not immediately obvious. They were teachers, the most dangerous of all, who passed along everything the previous 2 generations had learned, while appearing to do nothing more than educate children in state-approved curricula. Every single one of them had a day job. Every single one of them had a family. Every single one of them had stories that stretched backward through a century of quiet, patient, invisible resistance. And every single one of them was waiting. The fourth generation, born between 2130 and 2175, were the architects. They took the maps, the psychological profiles, the technical knowledge, and the pharmaceutical insights of the previous 3 generations, and began to design something. Not a weapon. System. Selene Vasquez was the central figure of this generation. She was a quiet woman who worked officially as a structural engineer for the Velthari-administered Infrastructure Bureau in what had once been Mexico City. She designed bridges, beautiful, practical, mathematically elegant bridges that the Velthari appreciated because they demonstrated the useful aspects of human intelligence without threatening anything. What she was actually designing, in notebooks hidden beneath the false bottom of a toolbox that had belonged to a great-great-grandmother, was the architecture of liberation. She called it the Resonance Project. The Nexus worked by monitoring electromagnetic signals in a specific frequency range. It was extraordinarily good at this. Better than anything humanity had ever built. Capable of detecting a whisper in a submarine at the bottom of the Mariana Trench if that whisper was encoded in the monitored frequencies. But it was also, like all systems built by minds that had stopped questioning their own assumptions, optimized for the threat it had been designed to counter. It was designed to stop humans from communicating with each other in ways that could coordinate a rebellion. It was not designed to stop humans from modifying the Nexus itself. Because why would anyone design a cage with a lock that the prisoners could reach? The answer, Selene understood after years of studying the Nexus architecture, was that the Velthari had not thought of it because they had never been prisoners. They had never had to think like one. She spent 16 years designing a modification protocol, a set of precise, timed interventions in specific Nexus relay nodes that would not destroy them but would retune them, shift their monitoring frequency by exactly 11%, creating a narrow band of unmonitored communication space, not enough to coordinate a planetary uprising, but enough to send a signal to every cell of the Ember Coalition simultaneously. Enuk Tosaya, after 200 years of silence. It is time, right here, right now. If this story is moving you the way it's moving everyone who hears it, please hit that like button. Share this with your community. And subscribe because we are only halfway through, and it gets so much more powerful from here. The 5th generation, born between 2175 and 2220, were they had been trained since childhood to be ready, though they did not know for what, exactly, until the notebooks of Selene Vasquez were passed down to them along with everything else. Commander Ashmarabi was 31 years old when he first read the full archive. All of it, every generation's contribution, compressed into a data structure stored in what appeared to be a family recipe database. He sat in a small apartment in what had once been Tehran, now designated Administrative District 7 of the Velthari's Northern Hemisphere Management Zone, and he read for 3 days without sleeping. When he was done, he wept, not from grief or despair, but from something he didn't have a word for immediately. Later, he would call it He had inherited 4 generations of sacrifice, and intelligence, and patience, and love. He had inherited the work of people who had died without seeing the goal, who had spent their entire lives in service of a future they would never witness. He called his sister Leela, who was a biochemist in what had been Istanbul, and said, in the coded language their grandmother had taught them, the recipe is complete. Time to cook. Lila laughed. She had been waiting for that call her entire adult life. The 6th generation, born between 2220 and 2265, were the diplomats. This might seem like an odd inclusion in a resistance story, but the Ember Coalition had always understood something important. Winning was not enough if you did not know what came after. A young diplomat named Ezra Sabansu had spent 30 years studying every species in the Velthari's known network of subjugated worlds. There were 11 of them. 11 civilizations living under the same cage humanity lived under. Each one monitored by a regional nexus system. Each one bound by their own version of the Compact of Subjugation. Ezra had found ways to communicate with representatives of 4 of these civilizations. Not through electromagnetic signals, which the Nexus monitored, but through the deeply underestimated channel of trade. Physical goods crossed between species under the Velthari's administrative approval, inspected thoroughly for weapons or communication technology. They were not inspected for meaning. Ezra and his counterparts had developed a shared language embedded in the craftsmanship of exchanged goods in the specific warp and weft of fabrics, in the positioning of decorative elements on pottery, in the mathematical relationships between measurements in architectural models submitted for Velthari approval. For civilizations bound together by the patient work of a single human diplomat who had never, in his life, sent an unauthorized electromagnetic signal. He called his network the Quiet Alliance, and by the time he died at 87, it encompassed 7 species, united in patience, in readiness, and in the particular kind of fury that only comes from 400 years of swallowed pride. The 7th generation, born between 2265 and 2310, were the technicians. They built the tools, not from scratch. They did not have the resources for that, not with Velthary oversight monitoring industrial output across the planet. They built from repurposed materials, from agricultural equipment, from the components of medical devices, from the guts of welfare-approved infrastructure projects that employed human engineers who happened to be, all of them, members of Ember families. The tools were small, portable, and extraordinary. A device the size of a thumb drive that could, when placed within 3 meters of a Nexus relay maintenance port, execute Selene Vasquez's modification protocol automatically. 6,000 of these devices, distributed across 12 nations. Hidden in the most boring possible places in kitchen drawers, in the false bottoms of children's toy boxes, in the spines of old books on shelves that had not been disturbed in decades. 1 per relay node, perfectly matched to the maintenance window schedule that astronomers had been charting for 2 centuries. There was a moment, a single moment, when the 8th generation, born between 2310 and 2360, the generation responsible for final coordination, realized what all of this actually meant. Not abstractly, not philosophically, actually, viscerally, in the body. A young woman named Mara Lindquist sat in a farmhouse in what had been Sweden and held her grandmother's recipe book and realized that her grandmother's grandmother's grandmother had been one of the original Ember Coalition engineers. That this book, with its seemingly ordinary instructions for bread and soup and preserved vegetables, contained within its patterns a century of accumulated intelligence. She realized that every person in her family tree back 6 generations had lived their entire life inside this story, had chosen partners and had children and made friends and built careers, all within the context of this singular, invisible, multi-generational project. She cried, too, like Arush Marabi, 200 years before her. She called it in, and then she got to work. If you're still watching, you already know that this is not just a story about aliens and rebellion. It is a story about what families are truly capable of when they commit to something larger than themselves. Like, subscribe, share, let this story reach everyone who needs to hear it. The plan was simple in its final execution, which is the mark of all great plans. 400 years of complexity had been distilled into a single night. The date was April 14th, 2473, 432 years after the Compact of Subjugation had been signed. 6,000 maintenance windows would align across the globe over a period of 11 hours. 6,000 technicians, descendants of the original Ember families, each positioned with a device the size of their thumb, would execute the modification protocol simultaneously. The Nexus would not go dark. It would not explode. There would be no fireworks visible from space. The Valdori in their orbital administrative stations would see nothing unusual on any of their monitors. What would change was 11% of the monitoring frequency, and in that 11%, for the first time in 432 years, humanity's cells of resistance would be able to speak to each other. Mara Lindquist coordinated the final distribution of technicians with a calm that she later said she did not feel. She felt, she said, like she was carrying something that weighed more than her body could hold. She was carrying 400 years of her family's work, the bones of 6 generations of people who had never stopped believing. At 3:17 GMT on April 14th, 2473, the first device was placed. At 3:19, the second. By 5 o'clock, 400 devices had been placed across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. By 9 o'clock, the number was over 3,000. By 14 o'clock, the last device was placed by a 22-year-old technician named Olu Okafor, a direct descendant of Dr. Priya Okafor, the woman who had written The Long Patience 430 years earlier. He placed it with hands that were absolutely steady, in a maintenance port and a Nexus relay station in Lagos, and he thought about his ancestor, and he said quietly, "We kept the patience. We found the door." The modification activated at 1423 GMT. 11% of the monitoring frequency went dark, and humanity began to talk. The first transmission was not strategic. It was not a battle plan or a military order. It was a single word sent simultaneously from every cell of the Ember Coalition to every other cell. The word was, hello. Then the second transmission came, from Ezra Sebonsu's successors in the diplomatic arm of the Quiet Alliance, relaying signals that were not of human origin. 7 civilizations, all on different planets, all under different Nexus systems. All of them had received the same modification from their own Ember equivalents, their own multi-generational resistance networks that had been quietly woven together through the craft language of trade goods over for centuries. 7 species saying hello to each other for the first time in freedom. The Veltari had been monitoring for 200 years for signs of coordinated rebellion. They had been watching for weapons, for military movements, for unusual industrial output, for encrypted signals. They had not been watching for a moment of contact between 7 species who had spent 400 years becoming ready, because they did not believe that was possible. They did not believe in the accumulative power of family memory. They did not believe that love could survive for centuries as a strategic instrument. They did not believe that ordinary people, living ordinary lives, could carry the weight of liberation across generations without being crushed by it. They were wrong about all of it. Please, right now, share this story. Like it. Subscribe. Because what comes next is the part that will make your heart break open in the best possible way. The Quiet Alliance had not been preparing for war. War was not the plan. War was what the Veltari expected, what they were optimized to respond to, what they had spent 1,000 years becoming very, very good at. The Quiet Alliance had been preparing for something the Veltari had no category for. They called it the Great Disclosure. Over the following 37 days, using the unmonitored 11% of the frequency band, 7 civilizations shared everything they knew about the not military intelligence, though there was that too. Something more important, the history of every civilization the Veltari had ever conquered. The cultural records, the music, the literature, the philosophical traditions of 43 species who had been subjugated, suppressed, or destroyed by Veltari expansion over the past 3,000 years. Species whose existence the Veltari had thought was safely erased, because the Veltari had not accounted for the one thing that they had no concept of: the archivist instinct. Humans are not unique in their impulse to preserve the stories of the dead. Several of the 7 allied species shared it in different forms, and over 4 centuries of quiet trade, they had been exchanging records, building a library of lost worlds, because some things are worth carrying even when carrying them serves no immediate purpose. The library contained 43 civilizations, their languages decoded, their histories reconstructed from fragments, their philosophies translated into forms that could be understood across species barriers. And among them, 3 things that changed everything. First, the history of the Velthari's own origin, recovered from records of a species they had believed they had completely destroyed 4,000 years ago. A species that had, before the Velthari arrived, been in peaceful contact with them. That had been the Velthari's first conquest. That had been where the pattern started. Second, evidence of internal dissent within the Velthari homeworld. The crystalline beings were not monolithic in their views. There was a faction, small, suppressed, persisting across centuries, the way the Ember Coalition had persisted, that had opposed the expansion policy from the beginning. Third, a biological discovery made by the allied species biochemists across 4 centuries of shared research about the specific neurological mechanism in physiology that made conquest feel necessary to them. Not a cultural choice, but a biological drive that had never been addressed because no one outside the Velthari had ever understood it well enough. The Quiet Alliance broadcast, all of it, not to humanity, not to their own species, to every Velthari administrative officer, every ship crew, every colonial administrator, every member of the suppressed internal dissident faction, simultaneously and in the Veltari's own language. On every frequency the Nexus used, they flooded the cage with the truth about the people who had built it. The response was not immediate. Nothing that happens in the hearts of a species is immediate, but it was real. Within 6 months, 3 Velthari administrative districts had withdrawn their officers voluntarily, citing internal review protocols that had been filed by dissident faction members who now had documented evidence to support their long-standing objections. Within a year, the Velthari homeworld was in the kind of political crisis that only happens when a society is forced to look honestly at what it has done. Within 5 years, the Compact of Subjugation was unilaterally suspended, not by humanity's demand, not by military force, but by a vote within the Velthari's own governance structure, by a margin of one vote. 430 years of human patience, resting on one vote in an alien parliament. Yoratun was 475 years dead by then. Dr. Okafa had been gone for 420 years. Kalo Konkwa's bones had returned to the earth of Lagos centuries ago, but Mara Lindquist was alive. Olu Okafar was alive. They were in their 30s, the first generation of the Ember Coalition who would actually live in freedom. When the official notice arrived, a formal transmission from the Velthari Administrative Council, terse in the way of beings who are not yet fully comfortable with what they are doing, acknowledging the suspension of the compact and the beginning of renegotiation processes. Mara Lindquist was sitting in the same Swedish farmhouse where she had first understood what she was inheriting. She held her grandmother's recipe book. She did not shout or cry or celebrate with fireworks. She opened the book to the first page, where her grandmother had written in small, careful handwriting the words that every generation of their family had been told but never fully understood. "Keep the patience. Find the door," she wrote beneath it. In her own handwriting, "We found it." Then she called Olu. He answered on the second ring. He had been waiting. "Did you get the notice?" she asked. "Yes," he said. There was a long silence. 430 years, she said. 432, he corrected gently. "From the signing to today." "Your ancestor wrote the long patience," Mara said. "What do you think she would say right now?" Olu was quiet for a moment, outside his window in Lagos. The city was beginning to understand what had happened. People were in the streets, not rioting, not marching, just standing in the open air with the particular dazed look of people who have been living inside a cage for so long that open space feels temporarily unreal. "I think," he said finally, "she would say exactly what she wrote. Patience is not passive. It is the most aggressive thing there is. It is the refusal to let the present moment be the final word on what is possible." Mara closed the recipe book very carefully. "It worked," she said. "It worked." He agreed. If you have made it this far, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with the people in your life, because this is not just a story about aliens. It is a story about what we pass down, what we carry forward, and what we are capable of when we commit to each other across time. The renegotiation process took 11 years. It was difficult, contentious, marked by setbacks and frustrations, and moments when it seemed like the Velthari's dissident faction would be overruled by more conservative elements who preferred the old arrangement. But the library of the 43 lost civilizations was always there. The biological research was always there. The history of the first conquest was always there. And the 7 species of the Quiet Alliance were no longer quiet. They were at the negotiating table. Every one of them. For the first time in history. 7 species who had spent 4 centuries learning each other's craft languages, each other's philosophical traditions, each other's ways of understanding justice and dignity and what it meant to be free. They were not a military alliance. There was something the galaxy had never seen before. A coalition of the patient, bound together not by power or fear, but by the accumulated decision, made over for centuries, to preserve each other's stories. The Velthari, dissident faction, whose name, in their crystalline language, translates roughly as the resonance of doubt, had spent 3,000 years being suppressed. They were, in the Velthari's own biological terms, the part of their species that had never been comfortable with conquest, whose neurological makeup ran slightly differently, who had always felt the wrongness of what their civilization was doing but had lacked the evidence, the support, and the language to articulate it effectively. The library gave them all 3. The final treaty was not called a treaty. The Velthari did not have a word for the kind of agreement they were making, because it was not a kind of agreement they had ever made before. It was not a ceasefire or a withdrawal or a reparations settlement, though it contained elements of all three. The human delegate Oluwukafer proposed calling it the Covenant of Continuing, and a Velthori dissident faction accepted the name because they understood its implication. This was not an ending. This was a beginning of something that would require ongoing work, ongoing honesty, ongoing willingness to be changed. The Nexus was not destroyed. Destroying it would have been satisfying but counterproductive. Instead, it was redesigned by Veltharian engineers working alongside human engineers, alongside engineers from all 7 allied species, into something it had never been. A communication network that nobody owned. Open access. No monitoring. No frequency bands assigned to suppress anything. A genuine commons of the stars. The first free transmission through the redesigned network was made by a human child. A 9-year-old girl in Lagos named Priya. Named, her parents explained, after a woman who had lived 430 years ago and had written something very important. She broadcast a recording of herself singing a song, slightly off-key, with enormous enthusiasm. The song was a folk tune from the coastal region of what had been southeastern Nigeria. It was old, possibly older than the compact itself, possibly older than the space age. It was about the sea, and about the way the sea always comes back, no matter how many times you push it away. It reached 43 inhabited planets before the girl had finished breakfast. On the Velthiri homeworld, in the chamber where the resonance of doubt had been meeting in secrecy for 3,000 years, and could now meet openly, one of the eldest members, a being who had lived for 2 centuries, and had spent all of it in opposition to their civilizations. Direction, received the transmission, and was still for a very long time. Then they translated the song into the Velthiri resonant language, and sang it back, slightly off, with enormous enthusiasm. Mara Lindquist died at 89 in the same Swedish farmhouse, with her children and grandchildren around her. Her recipe book was already being studied by cultural historians and linguists and resistance theorists across 12 species. She had donated it, with permission from her family, to the newly established archive of the Long Patience, which was headquartered in Lagos and had branches on 7 worlds. Her last words, reportedly, were, "Keep the patience fiend Tidor, and for star's sake, teach your children to cook." Olu Okufer lived to 94. He spent the last 2 decades of his life as a first human ambassador to the Velthiri homeworld, a position that required, as he explained in his memoirs, equal parts diplomacy, archaeology, and the willingness to eat several things that did not agree with human digestion. His memoir was called The Long Patience, Volume 2, and its dedication read, "For Dr. Priya Okafor, who started counting, we finished the count." The Ember Coalition formally dissolved in 2491, 18 years after the Covenant of Continuing, having concluded that its purpose was complete. Its final act was to transfer the entirety of its archive, 430 years of documents, maps, encoded textiles, recipe books, folk songs, astronomical observations, and family histories, to the archive of the Long Patience. The transfer ceremony was attended by representatives of all 7 species of what was now called, with some amusement given its origin, the Quiet Alliance, though the alliance was no longer quiet. A Velthri dissident elder attended the ceremony as an official observer. They brought a gift, a crystal sphere, hand-formed in the traditional Veltheri style, inside which was suspended a recording of a 9-year-old girl singing a folk song about the sea. The archivist who received it wept. The Veltheri elder asked, through a translator, why the archivist was crying. The archivist said, "Because it means you heard us." The Velthri elder was still for a moment. Then they said, "We heard you. We are still listening. We will keep listening. This is also, we are learning, what families do." And that was how it ended and began, not with a battle, not with a weapon, not with any of the things that empires understand and expect. It ended and began with a child singing off-key on an open network. It ended and began with 430 years of ordinary people choosing, every single day, to carry something forward. It ended and began with the understanding that the most powerful force in any universe is not the force that can destroy the fastest. It is the love that refuses to stop transmitting. Bekaselau, encoded in recipe books and folk songs. and astronomical charts, and the patient mapping of every node in every cage, moves at a frequency that no Nexus was ever built to block. Humanity did not defeat the Humanity outlasted them in the only way that has ever mattered, by being more human than any empire could account for, by being the species that never stopped teaching its children who they came from and what they were carrying, by being the species that understood, deep in its ancient bones, that family is not just the people alive right now. Family is every person who ever believed in you before you existed. And humanity, it turned out, had a very, very large family. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, please like this video right now. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one, and share it with everyone you know. Because the world needs more stories about the power of patience, the power of love across generations, and the absolute, unbreakable, stubborn humanity that carries us forward. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this. The galaxy did not change overnight. Nothing real ever does. But in the years following the Covenant of Continuing, something shifted in the fabric of interstellar politics that even the oldest Veltheri historians had no precedent for. 7 species, each with their own wounds and their own languages and their own reasons for grief, had chosen to remain at the same table. Not because they had to, because they had spent 4 centuries learning how. The Quiet Alliance formally restructured itself into what became known as the Council of Accumulated Memory, a name proposed by the Keth, a small amphibious species from a water-heavy world in the Orion Arm, who had no written language, but possessed an oral tradition so precise that their historians could recite events from 600 years ago with the accuracy of a court transcript. The Keth had been the hardest civilization to reach during the long years of the Quiet Alliance. They did not use electromagnetic signals at all. Their entire communication culture was acoustic, vibrational, physical. The Veltheri Nexus had simply never been designed to monitor them because there was nothing, from a signal intelligence perspective, to monitor. But they had been watching. Their oral historians had been composing epic cycles about the Veltheri occupation for 2 centuries. Passing them mouth to ear through every generation, encoding in the rhythms of their spoken history the same patient fury that the Ember Coalition had encoded in recipe books. When Ezra Savansu's diplomatic successors finally made contact with the Keth Elder through the medium of physical vibration patterns, tapped into the hull of a trade vessel, the response had come back immediately, with the confidence of people who had been expecting this conversation for a very long time. The Keth word for the Ember Coalition, when translated into acoustic terms, and then into human language, meant roughly. The ones who remembered how to wait. It was, every human who heard it agreed, the most accurate description they had ever received. The first full session of the Council of Accumulated Memory took place in 2491. The same year, the Ember Coalition dissolved. It met not in space, not in any of the grand orbital stations the Veltheri had built, but on Earth, in Lagos, in a building constructed specifically for the occasion. The building was designed by a team of architects from all 7 species, working through months of translation, difficulties, and aesthetic disagreements, and the particular creative friction that comes from minds that do not share a common framework for beauty. The result was unlike anything any single species would have built alone. It was structurally improbable, deliberately so, full of angles and materials and acoustic properties that made no single species entirely comfortable and all of them strangely, powerfully at home. Olu Okofer called it the most honest building he had ever been inside. The agenda of the first session was not political. The council had agreed, during the 11 years of negotiation, that the first session would be cultural. An exchange, a mutual introduction between species who knew each other's resistance strategies but had never simply sat together and shared who they were. The Keth opened with a recitation. 3 elders, standing in the acoustic center of the hall, delivered 2 hours of oral history in their own language, untranslated, simply present as sound. No one in the room understood a word. Everyone in the room understood everything. When it was over, a human musician from what had been Senegal played a 20-minute piece on an instrument that had no name in any other language, and the Volturi dissident representatives sat very still in the way that the human delegation had learned to recognize, indicated they were deeply moved. The session lasted 4 days. No resolutions were passed. No treaties were signed. Nothing was decided except this: they would meet again, and again, and again. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this final chapter with everyone who has followed this story. Because this ending is everything the beginning promised, and it deserves to be heard. The hardest part of the post-Covenant years was not the politics. Politics, once the Veltheri internal crisis had stabilized into something manageable, followed a logic that diplomats and historians could map. The hardest part was the accounting. What had been lost in 432 years of subjugation was not just political freedom or scientific advancement, though both of those losses were enormous and real. What had been lost was the ordinary texture of cultures that had been compressed, suppressed, redirected, languages that had been allowed to atrophy because the Veltheri administrative system operated in a single lingua franca, art forms that had been discontinued because they required resources that were now diverted to tribute payments, family structures that had been disrupted by the administrative resettlement, policies that moved populations around the globe like pieces on a board. Humanity had survived, but survival is not the same as thriving, and the generations that had lived entirely under the Compact had lived smaller lives than they were supposed to live. This was the grief that came after the victory, and it was important not to look away from it. Mara Lindquist had written about this in her memoirs, in a chapter she called The Morning After, The Morning After. She wrote, "We must be careful not to let the greatness of what we preserved blind us to the enormity of what we lost. Both are true. Both deserve witness." The Council of Accumulated Memory took this seriously. One of its first standing committees was the Commission on Cultural Accounting, tasked not with assigning blame. Blame was addressed in separate and more contentious proceedings, but with documenting loss. The Commission spent 20 years producing a record. Not a legal brief. Not a political document. A record in the tradition of the archive of the long patience, honest, detailed, and committed to the idea that naming a loss is the first step toward deciding what to do with it. It was one of the most difficult documents any civilization had ever produced about itself. It was also, in the judgment of historians across 7 species, one of the most important, because it was honest, because it did not reach for silver linings where there were none, because it said "'tis up in it, and it cost this much, and we will carry this forward knowing its weight." The Veltheri dissident faction, now a significant political force on their homeworld, produced their own parallel document. It was cahier in the resonant language, something that translates approximately as the account of what we did. The 2 documents were released simultaneously. It was not an act of balance or equivalence. It was an act of parallel honesty. 2 civilizations looking at the same set of events from different sides and refusing to flinch. On the day of the joint release, Olu Okafor stood in the archive of the Long Patience in Lagos and held his ancestors' first slim volume. The Long Patience, 70 pages, hand-typed, 450 years old, and thought about the distance between that moment and this one. He thought about Dr. Priya Okafor, writing at her kitchen table in 2043, 2 years into occupation, in a world where the cage had just been locked, writing about a future 4 centuries away with the calm precision of someone doing math. He thought about what it takes to believe in a future you will not live to see. He thought about all the generations in between who had carried that belief forward, not as an abstract hope, but as a practical daily discipline. And he understood something he had not fully understood before, even after everything. The Long Patience was not really about endurance. It was not about waiting for circumstances to change. It was about the decision, made actively every single day, by every single person, in every Ember family across 430 years, to remain fully human in conditions designed to diminish them. To keep cooking real food and singing real songs and telling real stories, and falling in genuine love, and raising children who knew who their grandparents were and what they had believed. The resistance had not been the devices placed in the Nexus relay nodes. Those were the mechanism. The resistance had been every dinner table, every bedtime story, every grandmother who taught her granddaughter a folk song not because it was useful but because it was true. Humanity had not survived the Veltheri because of any single act of heroism. Humanity had survived because it had never stopped being itself. Right here, before we reach the final words of this story, please like, subscribe, and share this video. This story took 400 years to happen, and it deserves to travel as far and as wide as possible. Thank you. P. The decade following the Commission on Cultural Accounting was, paradoxically, both the most difficult and the most generative period in post-Covenant human history. Difficult, because accounting for loss requires first admitting it. An admission is painful in ways that victory does not prepare you for. Generative, because once you know what was lost, you can decide what to rebuild. And humans, it turned out, were extraordinary at rebuilding. Languages that had been near extinct were revived, not as museum pieces, but as living tongues, adopted by young people who felt in them a connection to something that the compact years had tried to sever. Art forms that had been discontinued were not simply restored but transformed, merged with influences from the 4 centuries of compressed survival into something new. Stranger, sadder, fiercer, more honest than the originals had been. Family structures that had been disrupted were not reimposed from above, but rediscovered from below. In the particular way that humans have always rebuilt their social architecture after damage. Slowly, imperfectly, with enormous creativity and occasional chaos. New things were invented, because that is also what humans do. New music that could only have been made by a species that had lived inside a cage for 400 years, and come out the other side, still singing. New literature in which grief and triumph existed in the same sentence, without contradiction. New mathematics, some of it developed jointly with Keth acoustic theorists, that describe the world in ways no previous framework had been able to. On 7 worlds, similar processes were underway. The Council of Accumulated Memory had expected this. They had built their structure around it, a framework not for managing civilizations, but for witnessing them, for providing the kind of interstellar community in which each species could do the work of rebuilding without being alone. The Keith, who had never been significantly suppressed in the cultural sense. The Veltheri had simply not understood them well enough to suppress them effectively, became unexpected guides in this process. Their oral tradition contained 400 years of careful observation of what suppression does to a culture and what resilience looks like from the outside. Their historians became the most sought-after advisors in the Commission on Cultural Accounting, not because they had answers, but because they knew how to ask the right questions. The Veltheri, dissident faction, contributed something different. Access. For the first time, 7 civilizations had access to 3,000 years of Veltheri records. Not the sanitized administrative records that had been submitted to subjugated worlds, but the full archive, including the records the Veltheri had kept of every civilization they had encountered, every species they had suppressed or destroyed, every internal debate they had suppressed about whether conquest was truly necessary. The archive was enormous. It took decades to translate, decades more to process. Some of what it contained was devastating records of species that no longer existed, whose loss could now be fully understood for the first time. Some of it was unexpected evidence that several of those species had anticipated their own destruction, and had hidden archives of their own, buried on moons or in asteroid belts, or encoded in the spectral signatures of stars. The galaxy, it turned out, was full of hidden archives, full of species that had refused to be completely erased, full of the accumulated stubbornness of civilizations that had decided their stories were worth preserving even when no one was there to receive them. The Council of Accumulated Memory established a recovery program. Ships from multiple species, carrying teams of archivists and linguists and cultural historians, began the work of finding and opening these hidden caches. It was the longest ongoing project in galactic history. It would take centuries. Everyone involved accepted this with equanimity, because by this point, thinking in centuries felt natural. Humanity, in particular, had been trained for it. Ulu, Ukefa's granddaughter, born in 2520, was named Priya. She became one of the leading archivists of the recovery program, specializing in the acoustic records left by a species called the Vethmor, who had hidden their entire cultural archive in a system of resonant chambers carved into the bedrock of their home planet's largest moon a century before the Veltheri arrived. The Vethmor had been gone for 2,000 years. Their language had been unknown. Their culture had been a blank space in the records. Priya, Okafaryang Priya, the 4th generation to carry that name, spent 11 years learning to hear them. When she finally cracked the resonant code and the first Vethmor voices emerged from the chambers in their full acoustic complexity, she sat down on the surface of that moon in her envirosuit and did not move for a long time. Later she would write that what she felt was not triumph. She had expected triumph, What she felt instead was something she could only describe as obligation fulfilled, the sensation of a message that had been waiting 2,000 years finally arriving at its destination. The Vethmor had not known if anyone would ever come. They had made their archive anyway. They had carved it into rock and sealed it, and trusted the future in the way that you trust the future when you have no other option. They had been right to trust. She played the first Vethmor recording at the next Council of Accumulated Memory session. 43 species were represented in that session by then. The council had grown significantly as the Velthari archive continued to be opened and recovered. Civilizations were contacted or the recording lasted 4 minutes. It was a piece of music, simple, clear, made on instruments that no living being had ever heard played before. It was recognizably joyful in a way that needed no translation. The chamber was completely silent. When it ended, then the Keth Elder, who was serving as the session's ceremonial anchor, began to hum, very low, in the acoustic frequency that in Keth tradition indicates grief, accompanied by gratitude. One by one, every other species in the room added their own equivalent sound. Human delegates wept openly. The Velthari dissident representatives resonated at a frequency that their own cultural historians later described as remorse becoming responsibility. It lasted 11 minutes. Then they got back to work, because that is what you do. You witness. You grieve. You receive what was left for you, and then you get back to work, carrying it forward, because someone trusted the future with it, and the only worthy response to that trust is to keep going. If you have watched this story all the way to its final words, then you already understand why we tell stories like this one. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, share it with everyone in your life, because the world needs more reminders that patience is power, that love across generations is real, and that humanity, at its best, is absolutely extraordinary. In 2531, 60 years after the Covenant of Continuing, the Council of Accumulated Memory commissioned a monument, not a statue, not an arch, not anything that expressed victory or power. They commissioned a library, the largest library ever constructed, orbiting the point in space equidistant from all 7 founding member worlds. A mathematical impossibility that required a small stable orbital adjustment every few decades, but that every species had agreed was worth the engineering cost because the symbolism mattered. The library contained everything. The archive of the long patience, the catheral histories, rendered in permanent acoustic chambers that any visitor could enter and simply listen. The full Vethmor archive, the records of 43 recovered species, the Velthari's own full history, including the parts they had tried to hide from themselves. Every folk song, every recipe book, every hand-woven textile with its encoded resistance message, every astronomical chart of Nexus relay nodes made by human observers who appeared to be studying stars. It contained Dr. Preya Okafer's original 70-page document, The Long Patience, in a sealed case at the exact center of the structure, under a light that was always on. The library was called, in 7 languages simultaneously, the same thing. The translation varies slightly, depending on the species, but the meaning is consistent across all of them. It is called What We Kept. At the dedication ceremony, the eldest living descendant of the Ember Coalition's founding generation gave a short address. Her name was Adezo Konkua. She was 81 years old, and she was the great-granddaughter of Kalo, the cultural liaison in Lagos, who had spent 20 years smiling at Velthari administrators while translating their arrogance into intelligence. She stood in the central hall of the library, beneath the light that was always on, and she said, "My ancestor wrote that they are not watching for subtlety. They are watching for force. They cannot conceive of an enemy who moves at the speed of culture rather than the speed of weapons." He was right, and we spent 400 years proving it. But I want to say something that I do not think gets said clearly enough in how we tell this story. She paused. We were not the enemy. We were never trying to be anyone's enemy. We were trying to be ourselves. The resistance was not a military strategy that happened to use cultural forms. It was a cultural commitment that happened to produce liberation. The goal was never to defeat the Velthari. The goal was to remain human. Everything else followed from that. She looked around the hall, at the 7 species gathered, at the representatives of 36 recovered or memorialized civilizations. At the Velthere dissident elders who had traveled from their homeworld to be present. At the young Priya Okafor, standing in the second row with tears running down her face. "Keep the patience," Sades said. "Find the door. Teach your children to cook." She smiled, and never, ever stopped transmitting. The applause, in 7 forms, acoustic and electromagnetic and vibrational and crystalline resonance, and 3 others that human sensory apparatus cannot fully perceive, lasted for a very long time. Afterward, in the archives section of the library, the original recording still plays on a loop in a small room that anyone can enter at any time. It is a 9-year-old girl named Priya, slightly off-key, singing a song about the sea. And somewhere across the galaxy, on 43 worlds, and in the memories of every species that has ever decided that their story was worth keeping, the sea always comes back. No matter how many times you push it away, it always comes back.